Welcome, everyone, once again to our latest Massachusetts Peace Action program. Massachusetts Peace Action is a nonprofit organization. We're a peace group in Massachusetts. We're an anti-war group. We want the U.S. government to end its involvement in foreign interventions. We want our taxpayer money to be spent on healthcare and education and not on the Pentagon and foreign interventions and nuclear weapons and wars. As far as Palestine and Israel, we want the U.S. to not send like $3.8 billion a year to Israel to subsidize its occupation. That $3.8 billion a year, it amounts to over $10 million a day. And while our own infrastructure crumbles here at home and people don't have health care and people are struggling with student loans, our taxpayer money could be much better spent. The Israeli occupation of Palestine has been going on for decades with the support of the US, with the financial and political support of the US. So we've been seeing a lot happening in current events. So we arranged this program on short notice. We're joined today by Rania Khalek. Rania is a journalist with Breakthrough News. Be sure to check her out. She previously worked for the Electronic Intifada, which is one of the most important publications on the Palestine and Israel related issues. So, Rania, thank you so much for joining us today, especially on such short notice.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's great to be with everyone.
Right. So at Mass Peace Action, we have a working group, a Palestine-Israel working group. And there's a lot of people in our group who are like experts on this issue. They've been working on it in many cases longer than I've even been alive. And so we have some experts on Palestine and Israel in the group, but not everyone in Mass Peace Action and in the public is an expert on this issue. So just to make sure that we're all on the same page here and brought up to speed, can you give us a brief overview of what's happening currently in Israel and Palestine and Gaza and the occupied territories, and some of the historical context of what got us to this point?
Right. So what's happening right now is an explosion of violence, Israeli aggression against Palestinians, but it's not new. It's part of decades of settler colonialism. We have to go back to how Israel was founded, and because that's what explains what's happening today. Israel was founded in 1948 as part of a premeditated campaign of ethnic cleansing that pushed out 750,000 Palestinians in historic Palestine to create the state of Israel and replace them with Jews from all over, mostly from Europe initially. So this was from its inception. The state of Israel, Zionism, is a settler colonial project to create a Jewish state in an area of the world that has a large non-Jewish population. It has a large indigenous Palestinian population. And in order to do this, like every settler colonial state, there had to be a very violent campaign to remove the indigenous population. That's how Israel was founded. And since then, Palestinians have been split into different places, right? There's all these Palestinian refugees in countries all across the Middle East, but there's also about 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank. There's about 1.5 million Palestinians inside what's considered present-day Israel, who are treated like second-class citizens, who weren't removed in 1948. And then there are Palestinians in Gaza, 80% of whom are actually refugees from what are now Israeli cities and towns, who were pushed out in 48 and afterwards. And so it's important to understand that context, because since Israel's founding, in order to maintain this Jewish state that has so many Palestinians in it, so many indigenous people in it that aren't Jewish, they have to carry out constant violence and methods of domination and control against the native population. And that's why Palestinians are split into so many different places and being pushed into smaller and smaller enclaves and ghettos, whether it's in the West Bank, where Palestinians are surrounded by growing Israeli settlements that push them off their land, are surrounded by segregation barriers, what's called the apartheid wall, are surrounded by Israeli soldiers and checkpoints. This is an attempt to control and dominate the native population and push them into smaller and smaller ghettos. And then you have Palestinians, like I mentioned, that are in 48 Palestine, that are in present day Israel, who are explicitly discriminated against. They have Israeli citizenship, but there are 50 laws, at least 50 laws on the Israeli books that explicitly discriminate against non Jews, that explicitly discriminate against them. And right now, those Palestinians in particular are actually under attack by Israeli Jewish mobs. That are organizing, basically settler mobs inside Israel that are organizing to attack the Palestinians inside mostly mixed towns inside Israel. And then you have the 2 million people in Gaza who, for the last 15 years, have been under air, land, and sea blockade. And this is another method of control of this native population to try to force them to submit to basically their own erasure. This siege has been in place basically because the Palestinians in Gaza voted for Hamas, because they voted the wrong way in elections back in the early 2000s. And they've been under the siege ever since, and they've been subjected to these frequent, these frequent airstrike assaults, right? We saw it in 2008, 2009. We saw it in 2014, Operation Protective Edge that killed 2,200 Palestinians, including over 500 children. And we're seeing it again now with over 200 Palestinians killed in the course of the last week, including over 60 children. And these campaigns are meant to try to basically destroy Palestinian resistance, to try to destroy Hamas and try to decrease their military capability, but also to try to kind of terrorize the civilian population. Because if you look at what Israel's bombing in Gaza, they're bombing residential apartment buildings, they're bombing media buildings, they're bombing people's homes. 15 Palestinian families have lost 3 or more members in the last week in these Israeli air assaults. That is a targeted campaign against a civilian population. And just to give some context and overview of how this recent explosion of violence came to be, there's an ongoing status quo violence against Palestinians, whether we're talking about the siege in Gaza that's made it, that's de-developed it and made it nearly unlivable, or whether we're talking about the apartheid existence, the segregation, Jim Crow existence of Palestinians surrounded by checkpoints in the West Bank, or whether we're talking about the second-class citizenship of Palestinians inside Israel. This is ongoing, daily, routine violence against Palestinians that they have to deal with when Gaza's not being bombed, right? But in recent weeks, in the last month, I would say, there's been this escalation that began in Jerusalem by the Israelis. First, there's this issue with the neighborhood Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem that has been in the news a lot the last few weeks. There's been an ongoing court battle with Israeli Jewish settler organizations trying to take over the homes of the Palestinians who live in Sheikh Jarrah, many of whom are actually refugees from present day Israel. They moved to this neighborhood back in the 50s after they were kicked out in the campaign of ethnic cleansing across historic Palestine. And so they've been living there ever since. But as is happening across a lot of Jerusalem, there's this attempt to Judaize occupied East Jerusalem, to basically change the demographics so it can be majority Jewish instead of majority Palestinian. And so in order to do that, you have these settler groups, these settler organizations filing these lawsuits using the Israeli court system to try to evict Palestinians from their homes by making these claims that, these homes actually belong to Jews historically. And this has been accelerated in recent weeks with the court order was about to come down that was essentially going to evict these Palestinian families and ethnically cleanse them from this neighborhood. And so that's one side of it. There was protests in relation to that. Israeli settlers were attacking Palestinians over this. There was these death to Arab mobs by Israeli extremists in occupied East Jerusalem in conjunction with this attempt to evict these families. And then on top of that, there was a provocation at Al-Aqsa Mosque. So there's this other layer of this conflict where there's something called the Temple Mount movement, which is a Jewish extremist movement that seeks to demolish the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is in Jerusalem and is the third holiest site in Islam and is very important to Palestinians. This attempt to demolish, they want to demolish Al-Aqsa Mosque and rebuild in its place build in its place a third Jewish temple in order to bring about the end times. It's this very messianic, religious, movement that's very extremist, and they've grown in somewhat in popularity, but more in political power in Israel. There's people who are in the Temple Mount movement who are now in the Israeli government. And so they have more backing from the Israeli government than they used to. And they are always carrying out these provocations, trying to get into the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so in the last month, there was a provocation, not just from the settlers trying to get into the mosque and trying to harass Palestinians during Ramadan, but also Israeli police. And we saw that, a couple of weeks ago with these crazy images of Israeli police throwing stun grenades and tear gas and rubber bullets at Palestinians as they were praying in the mosque. So these two provocations, these two very big provocations with Sheikh Jarrah and Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, ended up, becoming bigger as Hamas got involved, right, and fired rockets at Jerusalem in solidarity with Palestinians in Jerusalem, and what they felt was defense of them against Israel's aggression. And Israel then, took what was happening in Jerusalem and turned it into a war against Palestinians in Gaza. And since then has been relentlessly, essentially carpet bombing Gaza. And so that's how we are where we are today. But I also want to note that, what's happening in Gaza also, whether the stuff in Jerusalem had happened or not, Israel does every few years carry out these massive bombing campaigns in Gaza. The Israelis call it mowing the grass. It's a really gross euphemism for essentially cutting down the military capabilities of Palestinian resistance groups in Gaza and of just kind of terrorizing the population, bringing Gaza back to the Stone Age every few years. But what's been interesting about this round is that despite Israel's frequent bombardments of Gaza, and destruction of this very small, open air prison that they've created, their strategy hasn't worked, because what groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza have shown is that they've still, despite being under one of the worst sieges, like this terrible siege, one of the worst in modern history, they've still managed to achieve military capabilities that are better than the last round, where they're able to hit with their rockets all up to Tel Aviv repeatedly. This hasn't happened before. So Israel's strategy isn't even working. And I think, we, as devastating as this has been, we have to recognize how resilient Palestinian resistance has been, not just from Gaza, but also from the West Bank, where people are protesting against the airstrikes in Gaza, in solidarity with people in Gaza, as well as Palestinians across, who are citizens of Israel across 48 Palestine, have actually been protesting what's happening to Palestinians as well. So there's kind of this uniting taking place among Palestinians that we haven't seen in a very long time.
Thanks, Rania, for that overview. There's a lot to unpack there, especially for if people are unfamiliar with this situation. There's a lot to unpack. But one thing I do want to mention is that when people say rubber bullets, these rubber bullets are actually steel bullets with a rubber coating around them, and Israel makes it seem like, oh, we're just shooting these harmless rubber bullets. People have lost eyes from it. I think people have died from it, right? So I did want to note that. Can you talk a little bit about how in Israel, with Israeli policymakers, people in the government, and Israel in general, how they consider the very existence of Palestinians to be a demographic threat? That's a phrase that's often used. And can you talk a little bit about the culture of white supremacy in Israeli society?
Yeah, so it's not just Israelis, by the way, in government, or Israelis generally, who speak about Palestinians as a demographic threat. We also hear that sort of rhetoric from liberal American politicians on a pretty routine basis. You always hear Israel faces a demographic threat. What that means is it means Palestinian babies, essentially. That Israel is this territory that, where something where millions of Jews live, but also almost an equal number, I think, of Palestinians live, if you include the Palestinians across the West Bank, across Gaza, and the Palestinians inside present-day Israel. And they consider these people to be a demographic threat because Israel's supposed to be a Jewish majority state, right? And that's why it has to practice apartheid, where millions of Palestinians are under occupation and have no rights. Because if you were to give Palestinians equal rights, that's the demographic that they're talking about. Palestinians might outnumber Jews, or Palestinians, might have more representation in government than Jews if they outnumber them. This is what they're talking about when they're talking about a demographic threat. It's explicitly racist language that literally looks at the number of Palestinian babies and calls them a threat, sheerly because of their identity, because they're Palestinian. And we hear this rhetoric from people who support these liberals in America who support the two-state solution, which is just a delusion at this point. But the idea is Israel has to have two states because they face a demographic threat. And if they don't have the two-state solution, they're going to have one state where they can't be a Jewish state. And again, this is explicitly racist. If having a Jewish state requires the oppression and routine murder of like Palestinian children in Gaza, then sorry, but having a Jewish state isn't worth it. If it requires this much violence against the indigenous population and talking about them as a demographic threat is racist. It is white supremacy. I mean, we could imagine this is how, not imagine, you don't have to imagine, this is how Native Americans were once viewed in the US, and non-whites were once openly viewed in the US as a demographic threat, and this is how the sort of like white racist the far right in the world speaks about the world population. They talk about brown and black people outnumbering white people soon, what they call white replacement theory. This is as far right as you can get. This is like KKK language, but we don't accept it as liberals, as people who support equal rights and human rights. We don't accept that kind of rhetoric from the Tucker Carlsons of the world, right? We don't accept it from the white supremacists of the world. Yet somehow, when it comes to Israel-Palestine, it's acceptable rhetoric that's okay in polite society, and it just absolutely shouldn't be. And I'm sorry, because I got into the demographic, your white supremacist question. So Israel is in many ways a white supremacist state. It's more of a Jewish supremacist state, but even within the Jewish population in Israel, there is a hierarchy that's based on white supremacy. European Jews are the elites. They're at the top, right? People like Netanyahu, people who look like him, who are from European backgrounds. Then you also have what they call the Mizrahi Jews, right? The Jews of Arab descent, basically, people whose families are from Iraq and Morocco and other parts of the Middle East and have darker skin. And, they tend to be a little bit more economically disadvantaged among the Jewish population. They tend to be more working class. And then you have, African Jews, people from Ethiopia who are like on the bottom of that Jewish totem pole. But then underneath that, right, underneath all of that comes Palestinians because they're not Jewish at all. And so in many ways, when it comes to Israel, among the different races of Jews, Jewish supremacy is the one thing that does unite them, or at least society, against Palestinians. But it's important, it absolutely is important to look at it through the context of white supremacy, because it is a supremacist system that privileges one group of people over another group of people based solely on their identity, and sees them as more worthy of rights, and sees like the people who aren't a part of this in-group, the Palestinians, as being less worthy of rights and essentially completely dehumanized. It's okay to kill their children in Gaza.
Right. Thanks for that, Rania. These issues are so dense for people who aren't like familiar with them. So there's a lot to unpack. So I'd encourage people, if they're not familiar with this stuff, to go back and rewatch what Rania is saying, because there's a lot of great information in all her answers. The first answer about the historical context, and now the second answer about the culture in Israel, about seeing Palestinians as a demographic threat, and the kind of hierarchy based on Jewish supremacy and also white supremacy in Israel. You mentioned liberal Democrats in the United States and how they kind of go along with this rhetoric of the very existence of Palestinians being a demographic threat to Israel. Can you tell us, where has Joe Biden and his cabinet been in terms of Palestine and Israel recently? And also after that, can you talk about where have the progressive Democrats been, the Squad and the other progressive Democrats?
So when it comes to the Biden administration, I think that because of these normalization deals that Trump called, peace deals between Israel and the various Gulf state countries, because of those deals and because the issue of Palestine in the last 10 years in the Middle East has seemed to kind of wane as an issue that people in the Middle East care about because they're dealing with so many other issues, whether it's the economic collapse in Lebanon or the dirty war on Syria that has now turned into a sanctions war on Syria, whether it's the Iraq was invaded and occupied and just completely shattered as a society because of what the U.S. did in the last 2 decades. People's own front yards, if you will, have just been so devastated, and there's been so much violence, the rise and fall of ISIS, all of these things that have happened, that it kind of seemed like Palestine wasn't the central issue anymore. And it really seemed like Israel had Palestinians under absolute control. Like they had them completely pacified. This was the thinking, not my thinking. This was just, I think, the general thinking among sort of liberal Democrat America, people in the Biden administration, is that Palestinians are pacified. Israel has control. There's no issue. It's just a status quo of apartheid. They figured out how to make it work. We can move on to other things. We can move on to going back to the Iran deal. We can move on to kind of moving away from the Middle East and paying more attention to investing more in this great power competition with China, this new Cold War. That's been the rhetoric of the Biden administration since he came into office. Even in the speeches he's given, the Middle East hasn't really been at the forefront of any of those speeches. The Israel-Palestine issue has certainly not been at the forefront at all. It's been all China, Russia, China, Russia. And so I think that they were really taken by surprise, as a lot of people were, by this, what I can only call is a Palestinian uprising. I don't want to say it's an intifada. That's a little bit too hyperbolic for what's happening. We can't call it that quite yet, and it might never be that, but it certainly is some sort of uprising and definitely unrest. And, the Israeli side has just exploded in violence. And I think, they also may not have realized just how right-wing Israel has become. I mean, the Israeli government in the last 20 years has become so incredibly right-wing that there are Kahanists in the government, people who are followers of Meir Kahana, who's this religious messianic extremist who, sorry, somebody speaking? I hear someone. No?
It must have been background noise.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. But you have people who support this guy, Meir Kahana, who envisioned historic, a greater Israel that he wanted to remove all Palestinians, just remove them ethnically, send them all to Saudi Arabia, get rid of them all, and let's make a greater Israel. Let's keep a greater Israel that includes Lebanon and parts of Syria, and let's just go all the way. There are people who support that ideology now in the Israeli government because Netanyahu has made this alliance with the far right in order to maintain his power. Israeli society has become more racist. I think it's probably one of the only places in the world I can think of that's at least considered a part of the Western world or whatever, that's accepted into Western polite democratic society as a country that's supposed to be reflective of those values. I think it's one of the only places like that where younger people are actually more right-wing than their parents and their teachers. That's a real, they're more racist. Younger people in Israel are more racist than their parents, which is kind of the opposite of what you're seeing in places like the US or across Europe, where younger people tend to be leaning more progressive and more accepting and more tolerant. And so I think that, anyways, I think the Biden administration didn't really see this coming, as a lot of people didn't. They just thought that the issue of Israel-Palestine was solved, permanent apartheid, oh well. And so there was a level of disengagement from the beginning of this administration on this issue, so that when this did happen, there was really nothing in place, no one in place to help de-escalate it. And so I think the Biden administration just kind of went into autopilot, and autopilot for America is support Israel unconditionally, say nothing, and let them do whatever they want. But I think that we can't be dismissive of the fact that there has been a shift And I don't want to overhype how important this shift is, because in terms of policy, I don't think anything's going to change. But in terms of the popular narrative around this issue, and in terms of the Democratic Party itself, there is definitely a shift taking place. And I think there's a couple reasons for that shift. I think part of it has to do with the organizing work for the last several years around issues of racism in America, and how the issue of Palestine has been important to and attached to that. I mean, I remember back when the Ferguson uprising was happening, there was this like beginning of this understanding that the issue of policing in America and the issue of racism against Palestinians is connected, because you have these police exchanges where all these different, all these American police, like all these different American policing institutions go to Israel to train with the Israeli police and like learn how to control and dominate people under occupation. And then sometimes they take those lessons and apply them back in the US, and vice versa. Israel also comes and trains with the American police departments and takes those lessons back to the US. So I think that the sort of anti-racist movement, the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, has helped draw attention to that issue, and also people becoming more understanding of the issues of racism and how state violence against people who are like unpeople function, and applying that logic to Palestine has helped. And a lot of the Palestine organizing that's taken place has also helped bring understanding to this issue. But I also think the Trump administration's close alliance with the Israeli government, particularly with Netanyahu and the Likud party, really helped educate a lot of liberals and Democrats on just how right-wing Israel is. It's kind of like a country that, if the Republican Party ran a country completely, that it would look like Israel. And so they started to see Israel as kind of like an arm of the Republicans. And even I think, there's also a shift among American Jews on this issue. Younger American Jews are really disgusted by the behavior of the Israeli government. They're not invested in Zionism as much as maybe their parents or grandparents were. They're far removed from World War II and the Holocaust, and it's just harder to weaponize that issue against them. And they live in like America, which is a multicultural place. Of course, it's very flawed, but it is a multicultural place where liberals like to say, oh, like we have, everybody gets to vote and everybody has equal rights, and they like to celebrate that. And so if you grow up in that culture, as a minority, and you're doing great as a minority in America, then you can't possibly look at Israel and be okay with the exclusionary eliminationist politics in that country and how it's led to all this violence against Palestinians. And so I think because of all the organizing around this issue, because of shifting opinions of younger people, and because of really the anti-racist struggle being at the forefront of American progressive politics, I think all of this has helped really shift opinion on this issue in the US. And that's why you see progressive members of Congress speaking out so forcefully on this issue. I mean, I think also, you have groups like Human Rights Watch, which isn't some like radical leftist group. In fact, sometimes it's used as like a weapon of the US government in terms of weaponizing human rights. But they also did write this report recently basically accusing Israel of apartheid. That's a big deal. And so it also helps give these progressive members of Congress cover for when they call Israel an apartheid state. So I think that all of this kind of mixed together is a reason that you see the rhetoric on this issue shifting, at least in the mainstream and in the Democratic Party to some extent. That said, I don't want to get too excited, because I still think policy changes are still years away. Because at the end of the day, even if Democrats hate Israel, the Democratic Party is still a party of imperialism. And the reason Israel is so important and is such an ally of the US and considered so valuable to the US is because it acts as an arm of US imperialism in the Middle East. It's like a client state, much in the same way that Saudi Arabia is. So because of that, because of its usefulness in the Middle East as this kind of like policing apparatus, it's like a bully in the Middle East for US imperialism. Because of that, Israel can get away with murder, and I think will probably continue to get away with murder.
Yeah, right. And I agree with you that there has been a shift or some sort of development in terms of the U.S. I guess, opinion towards this conflict. We have members in Congress who, like, their rhetoric on it is a little bit better than has traditionally been with the Democrats. Betty McCullough has a bill which wouldn't have been a bill like some years ago, but it is now, with some sign-ons from progressive Democrats, including Ayanna Pressley in Massachusetts. But I also want to note, people like Ali Abu Nima. He's been critical of people like Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and other progressive Dems because they're publicly calling for aid to Israel to be conditioned. Which, by the way, aid is a euphemism. It's like our tax money, like subsidizing the occupation and the
Yes.
oppression of Palestinian people. But these progressive Dems, they're calling for that aid to be conditioned. And people like Ali and others, Palestinians and others, they've been saying that we should just eliminate all financial and political support to Israel. And
Mm-hmm.
also not just Israel, but like Saudi Arabia and these other countries that like are like really bad human rights violators. So I just wanted to note that. But okay.
And he's right. And I think, and I want to also note, like, I think Ali's absolutely right to make that point, because it's not enough to call for conditioning aid to Israel. Like, what does that even mean? How would you even enforce those conditions? Because all of our aid to Israel as American taxpayers goes to funding Israel's military apparatus. All of it. It's essentially a huge subsidy to buy our weapons. That's what the U.S. military, the $3.8 billion a year is. It's like, here's $3.8 billion. You have to spend 80% of it buying American weapons. So it's just like a giveaway of American weapons to Israel, and it just goes directly into the coffers of like Raytheon and Boeing and all of our weapons companies. That's what that is. So I don't even know what conditioning aid would mean, a conditioning military aid would mean, because it's all being used to occupy and hurt Palestinians and to hurt Israel's neighbors, and that's a huge part of American imperialism. So if we really want to get to the heart of this issue, we have to look at American imperialism. This isn't some isolated issue where Israel's just a big, nasty, mean state that the U.S. funds and it hurts Palestinians. No, there's a bigger dynamic at play here, and it's the same reason the U.S. funds Saudi Arabia and sell Saudi Arabia weapons, because it's an arm of American empire in the Middle East and also sits on top of a lot of oil. So I think we're having the wrong conversation. Like, and so that's why I'm saying, it's nice that the conversation does seem to be shifting, but as activists, as journalists, as people who care about this issue and understand what's at the heart of it, we still need to be pushing. It's not enough. And this is where I think Ali makes an excellent point. It's not enough for AOC to just tweet. It's not enough for Ilhan Omar to just tweet. They should be calling for an end to Israel, to military aid to Israel. That's what they should be calling for at the least. And so while we should be excited to see the change in rhetoric from members of Congress, we also have to keep pushing them, even if we like them. And I think sometimes, the left has a problem doing that because it gets so excited that anyone is even saying these things to begin with. I'm not saying we have to yell at them, but they're politicians at the end of the day, and we're their base. And so it's up to us to push them to where we want them to be.
Yeah, definitely. And well, okay, I'll get into that later. I remember in 2014 when Israel was bombing Gaza, that was like a really sad time. Entire families were being eliminated. Entire neighborhoods were like basically being eliminated. There was so many dead bodies and dead children that they ran out of space to put them. They were putting them in like ice cream coolers and stuff. And that was like so sad. And a lot of it was coming from US weapons. While Israel was dropping all these bombs on Israel, while Israel was dropping all these bombs on Gaza, the US was like replenishing their like armaments.
Mm-hmm.
And could you talk a little bit about, I think I've heard you describe Gaza. Well, first of all, can you talk a little bit more about Gaza as an open air prison? And I think I've heard you and others describe it as like a laboratory, almost like a
Mm-hmm.
weapons testing laboratory. And could you talk about that a little bit?
So yeah, absolutely. Gaza is an open air prison. And I think that's actually generous to call it an open air prison. I think it functions more as like a concentration camp, a very large one, where 2 million people can't enter, they can't leave. I mean, yesterday on Breakthrough News, we've been doing these live streams, which I suggest everybody watching tune into today at 3 p.m. Eastern. on YouTube, but we've been doing these live streams, and we spoke to this journalist in Gaza. And I had to catch myself because, I asked her, I said, oh, were you in Gaza in 2014? And she said, of course I was in Gaza in 2014. I've never left Gaza. And she was maybe my age, like in her early 30s, I assume, or late 20s. And I was just thinking to myself, oh, right. Like, people can't leave. They're born in Gaza and they never leave because they literally are prevented from leaving by the Israelis. Israel controls the air, land, and sea borders to Gaza. Gaza is surrounded by Israeli gunboats. It's routinely subjected to Israeli drones and sometimes strikes, constantly surveilling it. And Israel is stationed at the border and shoots anybody that gets too close to it. We saw that happen 2 years ago during the Great March of Return, 3 years ago during the Great March of Return, when Palestinians protested at the border and started to walk to the border fence, and Israel just shot and killed people, or shot them and paralyzed them by shooting them in the knee. So this can only be described as a prison. It's an open air prison of 2 million people. I mean, in all of the 2000s, the UN would constantly warn, by 2020, Gaza's water is going to be undrinkable. It's 2021. Gaza has no drinkable water, and it's still in the situation it is. It's an active attempt of ongoing de-development and punishment of the population, of punishment of the Palestinian population in Gaza for voting Hamas in charge and refusing to submit to their own erasure. That's why Gaza is treated like this. On top of that, I call Gaza a weapons laboratory. And the West Bank is a weapons laboratory too, but I think Gaza is a more extreme version of this, because Israel has control over millions of Palestinians who have no rights, right? It has to come up with new and sophisticated and technologically advanced ways of controlling and dominating these people to prevent them from rising up against their oppression, to push them into smaller and smaller, enclaves, like I mentioned, and to pacify them, right? They can't just kill all of them. That wouldn't be okay. Like, the world, I think that would be like the red line if Israel just killed all of them. So it has to control them. And so in order to do this, it has this huge industry, this military technology surveillance industry is booming in Israel. Israel's called the startup nation. Part of the reason it's called that is because it has a bunch of startups that specialize in border technology, that specialize in border surveillance, that specialize in drone surveillance and drone warfare. Israel's, I think, one of the biggest sellers of drones in the world. And the reason it's perfected these mechanisms of control and domination and war so much is because it engages in constant warfare against Palestinians. So it has this population of defenseless guinea pigs who have no rights, that it can just test out its weapons on. And so it can put the stamp of approval on all of its weapons in the international weapons arena that say battle tested and combat proven. And that's true. It's battle tested and combat proven on Palestinians. And when you're able to say that as a weapons company, whether it's, Elbit Systems or the Israel defense systems or whatever, there's like a million different Israeli weapons companies. But as a weapons company, when you're able to say battle tested and combat proven, it's like the seal of approval that makes people want to buy your product. And so in many ways, what happens to Palestinians is not isolated to Palestine, because Israel then goes and sells all this technology it creates to control them to everyone, including the US. I mean, there's a lot of Israeli technology used at the US-Mexico border and at borders all around the world. I think like dozens and dozens and dozens of countries have Israeli drone technology. And so it's, in many ways, Palestine is kind of like this lens into how the most vulnerable among us are going to be treated, because the technology used on them is then used on people who are subjugated and oppressed all around the world.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And when 2014, when this was happening in Gaza, wasn't that the same time, around the same time the uprising was happening in Ferguson? And
Yes.
there was connections being made with activists online from Palestine to Ferguson, and people in Palestine were giving people in Ferguson tips on how to deal with tear gas and stuff like that. And there were tear gas canisters being made in the US, being used in like both places, being used in like
Exactly.
Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
So this is really important for all of us to understand as Americans. Can you talk a little bit about the politics in Israel and how these like bombing campaigns against Gaza and like violent belligerence against Palestinians, like how this helps someone like Netanyahu politically, and how Netanyahu does this oftentimes for political reasons with the support of the US. So can you talk about how they like kind of kill Palestinian people for like political reasons?
Yeah, I mean, in Israel and Israeli politics, and this is going back even to before it was the right wing Netanyahu types in charge. The more Arab blood on you have on your hands, the more qualified you are to rule Israel. People brag about it in their political campaigns. I mean, Benny Gantz, uh, who was like supposed to be the liberal opponent of Netanyahu during elections a few years ago, he had like a campaign ad that was all just showing the destruction of Gaza and taking credit for it from 2014. Um, so it is a way that Israeli leaders campaign is I've killed this many Arabs. Oh yeah? Well, I've killed this many Arabs. Well, I'm this good at controlling them. Well, I have this much blood on my hands. So there is like a hatred of Arabs that benefits you in Israeli politics. That said, Netanyahu is certainly benefiting from this because it has the right wing base that he relies on, riled up to back him and support it. Netanyahu is facing very real corruption charges. He's facing jail time, and the longer he stays in power, the longer he can postpone being prosecuted for that corruption. And so he's personally benefiting from this because, again, the more Arab blood you spill, the more Palestinian blood you spill, the more the right wing will support you. And the late like the I wouldn't call them left wing, but the so-called liberal Zionists in Israeli politics, they can't form a coalition because they're unwilling to form one with Arabs because they're so racist. But also, like, everybody's just backing Netanyahu, all these right-wing groups that are in power now. It used to be, it just gets more and more fascist as the years go on. And you have actual Kahanists in government allying with Netanyahu. And whenever Gaza is being bombed, they're always saying, oh, we're responding to rocket fire. And that rocket fire does scare Israelis. Like, they are in bomb shelters. Granted, like, they have bomb shelters and they have an Iron Dome system that the US funds that intercepts a good number of the rockets. So they have way more safety and prevention measures than Gazans could even imagine. But they're still scared. It's still paralyzing their lives. They have to go spend the day in a bomb shelter. And so as a result, they get angry and they get vengeful, and they're going to support whoever is looking like they're the strongest ones willing to mete out revenge. But we also have to remember, like, Israeli society in general has become more right wing. The settler mentality has really been exported from the West Bank into Israel proper. I've interviewed a number of Israeli leftists, journalists the past few weeks to really kind of understand what is happening in this society. And I encourage people to go to the Breakthrough News YouTube channel and check out these interviews I've done with people like David Sheen and Gideon Levy and Amira Haas. And as they describe it, I mean, the settler issue isn't just in the West Bank. There are settler organizations that have, for the last decade or so, been moving settlers into Arab neighborhoods inside Israel, into Palestinians' neighborhoods inside Israel, in an effort to push them out. So to kind of carry out the Nakba, if you will, what Palestinians call the catastrophe that happened in 1948, to finish the job, is what they'll say. And these are like religious zealots, really hardcore fascistic type of settlers who do basically to Palestinians inside Israel what they always do to Palestinians in the West Bank, which is terrorize them, harass them, try to push them out of their homes and off their land. And they're subsidized in some way by the state. So it's important to understand that as a part of Israel's lurch to the right, there's these like Jewish supremacist groups in Israel are organizing on WhatsApp lynch mobs. They're organizing lynch mobs and going out and trying to find Palestinians to attack in mixed Jewish Arab cities inside Israel. This is a really frightening development. It's not getting, because Gaza is being bombed, which obviously is the bigger story, it's not getting the attention it deserves because it says a lot about where Israeli society is headed. And what every single one of these people has told me is that, there doesn't seem to be any red lines on Israel, so it could just kind of carry on into this rightward shift where, like, the country becomes more and more eliminationist in its thought process about Palestinians. And so if there's no obstacles to stop that, eventually you're going to get to a point where something really dramatic and bad happens. And so it's really all in America's hands. Like there's going to be constant ongoing atrocities that get worse and worse. And not just by the Israeli state bombing Gaza, I mean by like lynch mobs in the streets attacking Palestinians. There's Palestinians inside Israeli cities who are being stopped by these mobs to like asking them a question, do you have a cigarette, and waiting to hear what accent they respond in to know if they're Arab or not so they can attack them. They're going and ransacking Palestinian homes, and then they're marking them with red paint so that they can identify who, like where the Arabs lived. It's very, very frightening stuff we're seeing take place. And this is like really a right-wing mob mentality just gripping Israel.
Yeah, right. And that's really scary to see. We see footage of that coming out. A lot of times they do it openly, and so like they're not ashamed of
And
it.
the police are like, the Israeli police are either standing idly by or in some cases participating. So, I interviewed this one Palestinian woman who's head of a civil rights organization inside of Israel. And she was saying how terrifying it was because if like you're attacked, you don't know who to call because the police might come and join your attackers. They're actually protecting the settlers. There's been, a couple of days ago, it was reported about 116 people have been indicted for the riots and violence inside Israel. Every single one of them has been an Arab. So like there's these Jewish supremacist mobs running around attacking Palestinians on video. They're doing it on video proudly, like pulling them out of their cars and beating them up on video. And no Jews have been arrested. Like that should tell you something about the state apparatus kind of supporting these lynch mobs.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt at all that the state apparatus supports these lynch mobs. Um, okay, so when we were talking earlier about the Democrats and the progressive Democrats, one of these progressive Democrats was Senator Ed Markey. He introduced the Senate version of the Green New Deal along with AOC, who introduced that in the House. And he faced a really competitive primary last year in 2020. Because he introduced the Green New Deal, he had a lot of really young, progressive activist support from like people in like high school and college, and like a lot of young people and climate activists. And even Mass Peace Action also endorsed him. Well, when these current events were going on, he released a statement on Twitter. His statement was a pretty typical Democratic statement, like essentially blaming both sides, and it was one of those typical statements. So his own base, his own campaign staff, and his own volunteers, they organized this like letter, which like it has like maybe close to 1,000 signatures by now, and like his own staff and his own volunteers, and it also has some elected officials and like maybe a dozen organizations, including Sunrise, that signed on. And in the letter, first of all, I just want to say real quickly that Palestinian civil society, in order to combat the occupation, like internationally, they've called internationally for a boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign, BDS, modeled after the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, which obviously was successful. So Palestinian civil society is calling us to support BDS, boycotts, divestment, and sanctions of Israel. This letter that the former Markey staff and volunteers and endorsing orgs wrote, they didn't even ask him to go that far. What the Palestinians are asking for, they gave him four like really reasonable demands, four demands which some members of Congress are already doing some of those. He didn't respond to those four demands. He released another statement, which was like kind of a better statement, but still like a bad statement. So, Rania, the question for you is, can you talk a little bit about, for members of Congress and senators, like the impact of the Israel lobby on elected officials in the U.S. and how the Israel lobby like drives U.S. policy towards Israel?
So I don't know. This is like an ongoing debate. I don't know if I really think that the Israel lobby necessarily drives U.S. policy entirely, because again, like the way I see it is Israel is this this arm of U.S. imperialism, and because it's such, you even have this video of Joe Biden back in the 80s that maybe a lot of people watching have seen, where he's like on the Congress floor and he's saying, Israel is so important for American interests. If there wasn't an Israel, we would have to invent an Israel. It's the best $3 billion investment we make every year. So I think people really need to understand that, like, even if there wasn't an Israel lobby, there would still be massive US support for Israel. That said, the occupation of Palestine, the ongoing occupation, the Israeli lurch to the right, the effort to, have this constant state of apartheid exist. That's not necessarily in America's interest. And so there is this Israel lobby that polices any member of Congress, any politician that gets, goes off the Israeli narrative, that maybe speaks about, the need for Palestinians to have equal rights, even speaks about two states. Like, the Israel lobby's kind of even turned against this BS idea of two states. And it's a very well organized lobby. It consists of lots of different groups. It's not just AIPAC. I think, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee is probably AIPAC, is probably the most well known, because every year, like every member of Congress, the US president and the vice president, secretary of state, every important official in the American government goes and like speaks and bows down to the Israel lobby and says, oh, like, I will, Israel's interests are our interests and we love Israel. And just the craziest statements you would never hear American politicians say about any other country. And that does show you the extent to which this lobby is effective in being able to control the narrative and maintain this unconditional, ongoing support for whatever Israel wants. Like, Israel has to make no concessions ever. And that's because of the Israel lobby. And it's not just because they donate to candidates, which they do. It's also because of it's a really tight network. I actually encourage people to go watch the Al Jazeera documentary that was then censored by Al Jazeera and never aired, about the Israel lobby, but then was posted by the Electronic Intifada. It's literally about, like, it's undercover footage of how the people at these various lobbying groups operate, and the way they're able to, push members of Congress. Like, AIPAC can literally write up a letter to support Israel during a bombing campaign, and all it has to do is just pass it around, and members of Congress won't even read it. They'll just sign it. And within like a day or two, AIPAC can get a letter signed by like almost every member of Congress supporting Israel's right to murder children in Gaza. That's how effective the Israel lobby is. And it's more, I think, of fear of being destroyed career-wise. Like, they're able to destroy careers. But on the plus side, I think that there's something to be said about, and yes, I agree with like what we were talking about earlier, where we shouldn't, the squad people aren't going far enough. That said, one of the reasons they're able to speak the way they do about Israel, where they can openly use the word apartheid, or say Palestinians deserve rights, or with the case of Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, openly support BDS, is because with this kind of new crop of politicians who are refusing to take corporate money, and have like a base of support, a grassroots base of support that will support them and sustain them, they're not as reliant on the kinds of networks that the Israel lobby is able to sabotage, so that members of Congress who go against Israel can't get elected. So the more people that we have who aren't in bed with corporations and aren't so dependent on corporate backing and on Wall Street and all these, like the weapons industry, the pharmacy, all these typical mechanisms of, raising money for your campaign, the more people we have like that, the more you're going to be able to have people in positions of power who can say, the reality to some degree about Israel. But yeah, I mean, that goes back to like movement building. And I think the Israel lobby is an increasingly tough situation, because as the Democratic Party's base becomes more progressive and more anti-racist and more anti-war and anti-corporate, it's going to be more and more difficult to control the narrative among that population. I mean, for the first time, the majority of Democrats actually support conditioning aid to Israel, which hasn't happened before. So that's why you see that's why you see Israel's supporters and Israel itself becoming more reliant on evangelical Christians in the US, because they're becoming like, they need the support of the right wing. Because, I'd say like in another 10 years, the narrative among liberals is just going to be like, you can't support Israel. It's going to be too nasty to even like whitewash. And that's what's happening now. It's becoming too nasty to whitewash.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I'm a little kind of encouraged to see, like that these young people, they understand these young activists who are like anti-racist and for better environmental policies and all that stuff. They're understanding the injustice that's happening in Palestine. It's not as easy to trick them as it was like older generations with like biased media coverage and things like that. All right, so for the last question of the evening, let me ask about, okay, I think you referred to the two-state solution as, I think you called it either an illusion or a delusion, I forget. But can you talk a little bit about why you said that? And can you talk about the Palestinian Authority and like their role in kind of supporting the occupation in some ways?
Yeah. So, I mean, the two-state solution is just not possible. Like, physically, it's not possible. And Israel made sure of that. The entire idea of a two-state solution was just this mirage to show the world, while underneath, Israel was just continuing to build settlements and make it impossible. And you have this quote from Ariel Sharon from like the 70s or 80s where he explicitly says that we're going to keep building these settlements and surround them with settlements to the point where we'll make a pastrami sandwich out of them, where it's just like a bunch of disconnected little ghettos. And that's what Palestine is now. It's disconnected ghettos all across the West Bank, where settlements just like snake in and around them, and then people are cut off from each other. And there isn't a state that can be made. Like, what, you're going to make a state out of a bunch of ghettos in the West Bank that aren't even connected and somehow connected to the ghetto of Gaza? There isn't any sort of sovereign state that can exist anymore because of the settlement construction and because of the way that Israel has just like split Palestinians off from one another. But despite that, American officials continue to pretend like it's a possibility and continue to talk about it like a possibility. But what you actually have and what you've had is this one state reality where there's millions of Palestinians that just have no rights over the government that dominates and controls their lives because they happen to live in the wrong area and not be Jewish. They happen to live in the West Bank or Gaza. And so people need to start recognizing that whether you support two states or not doesn't even really matter, because we have a one state reality and there's two options. It can either continue to be this segregationist, Jim Crow, apartheid state of occupation that routinely subjects Palestinians to bombings and killings, or it can be one state where everybody gets to have equal rights. I personally prefer the latter. And I think a lot of people, most people who aren't terrible human beings, should support the latter. And the only reason they wouldn't is because they're racist against Palestinians. That said, when you talked about the Palestinian Authority, I mean, I think it's really important to understand that the Israelis and Americans have completely co-opted the Palestinian Authority to just be an arm of the occupation. It just carries out the occupation locally, carries out some basic services in these little Palestinian ghettos, and its security forces, they suppress Palestinian protests. They really just occupy on behalf of the Israelis in many ways. And so the Palestinian Authority is just like a little puppet government. And you can kind of look at that and think, and it sort of confirms that if there were to be some sort of, Palestinian state, that's what it would look like. It would look like a puppet government that doesn't actually have any control over anything other than to just be an arm of the Israelis.
Yeah, that's I agree with that assessment. All right, so we're gonna wrap up the program. Thank you, Rania, again so much for fitting us into your really busy schedule. I want to encourage everyone to check out Rania. Check her out at Breakthrough News, and she's on there on YouTube, and she does writing. So check her out on Twitter, YouTube, and all that stuff. Thank you everyone so much for being with us today and listening to this program. I'll send out a recording of this video so you guys can share that around. I'll send out some links for advocacy, different things people can do to support the Palestinian cause. So again, Rania, thank you so much. Do you have any final words you want to leave us with?
Just thank you everybody for watching. And, I hope this becomes somewhat of a turning point on this issue, because what's happening in Gaza right now is if things continue in this direction, it's not going to be the last time that we see, dozens of Palestinian children killed in the course of a week, and this kind of punishment of a civilian population. So I really strongly I really thank you to everybody watching, but also like I hope this is for those who haven't been involved in this issue. I hope you get involved in this issue because there is a lot as Americans that we can do, because it is our country that's making this devastating, disgusting warfare possible.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. This oppression of Palestinian people is going on with the complete support of the U.S., financial and political support. So it's our moral duty to speak out against it and do what we can. And I will try to share some links with everyone on this call tonight of ways people can get involved. So again, everyone, thank you so much. And everyone, please have a great day.
Thanks, guys.